Well, she finished the job. She then pulled out the knife that she'd brought along with her and attacked Shanda again, then used a rope that she found to ensure that the deed was done. Once this night of terror was seemingly over, the girls then loaded Shanda back into the trunk of the car and drove to Lori's house to clean up and get a few drinks to cool off. While they were inside the house, they began to hear Shanda screaming from the trunk of the car. Lori immediately sprang into action, grabbing a paring knife and quickly making her way back to the trunk of the car. She then came back inside, cleaned up again, and then Lori and Melinda got back into the car and began to cruise the local country streets. It was about 2:30 a.m.
This case is almost
done. Before long, they heard Shanda calling out from the trunk once again. This time they pulled over and grabbed a tire iron, with Lori believing she had finally finished the job at this point. It's also been reported that around this time, their attacks took on a more sexual nature, but this isn't something I'm really comfortable discussing, so if these details interest you for whatever reason, I'll let you look up that aspect of the story on your own. When Melinda and Lori returned home early the next morning, the two girls were still at Lori's house waiting for them to return. When they asked what had happened to Shanda, Lori began to laugh and described the crime in extreme detail, adding that Shanda was still in the trunk of the car. Later that morning, the girls drove to a local gas station and filled their car up with gas. One of the girls went inside and grabbed a 2-liter Pepsi, pouring out the Pepsi and filling the empty bottle of gasoline. The girls then drove to Linen Road, north of Madison, and pulled Shanda back out of the car. They placed her just off the side of a gravel road, poured the gasoline on her, and started a fire. A coroner would later reveal that, despite what the girls believed, Shanda was still alive at this point. All of the girls returned home after stopping at a local McDonald's and having breakfast along the way. Melinda met up with Amanda later on that day and proudly confessed what she had done to Shanda. Amanda obviously didn't believe her at first, but that's when Melinda took her to the trunk of the car where Shanda's handprints could be seen all over the trunk, with her socks still being found inside as well. Amanda was speechless, truly speechless. Melinda then turned to her, swore her love for her, and begged Amanda not to tell anyone. Terrified, Amanda agreed. Later on in the morning, on January 11th, the morning after the crime took place, two brothers were heading out to the Jefferson Proving Ground to go hunting. Along the way, they noticed something on the side of the road that looked an awful lot like the crime scene, but they believed it to be a mannequin that someone had ditched. Until they got closer. They ran to the nearest phone to call the police as soon as they realized what they had uncovered. The police asked them to return to the scene of the crime and wait on a team of investigators to take their statements. Several state troopers and detectives showed up and began to collect forensic evidence from the scene of the crime. Police initially believed that this was some sort of gang violence, especially considering that the body had been placed in a suggestive pose before being burned and abandoned. They also learned that the victim's face and hands had been a particular point of focus for the assailant, as it seemed as though they were purposefully burnt so that the victim couldn't be identified. As all of this was taking place, Shanda's father had just woken up and found out that Shanda wasn't in her room. He looked all over for her, but she was nowhere to be found. He called her mother and explained what was going on, and they both searched for her, all to no avail. By that afternoon, they met with local investigators and filed a missing person report with the Clark County Sheriff. By 8:20 that evening, Hope and Tanya, Melinda's two friends, unexpectedly showed up at the local police station alongside their parents. The two girls were hysterical and could barely even speak. They were eventually able to get out that the victim police had found earlier that day had been none other than Shanda. The girls confessed to everything, telling investigators the entire series of events that had taken place that evening. Several local counties worked together to piece the story together, and eventually the Clark County Sheriff was alerted that the missing person report that had been filed earlier that day had officially been solved.
Wow.
Detectives soon obtained dental records and were able to positively identify Shanda. Both Melinda and Lori were arrested the following day, while the other two girls were already being held in police custody. By April of 1992, Tanya accepted a plea bargain with police. By September, both Melinda and Lori accepted plea bargains as well. Both Melinda and Lori were later sentenced to 60 years in prison, but rather shockingly, they were both paroled after just 26 and 25 years respectively. The two other girls were given much lesser sentences, with Hope being given 35 years though she only served 14, and Tanya being sentenced to 20 years but only serving 9. At the end of it all, I really don't know what to make of this case. I usually give you guys my brief input before the end of the story, but I just don't know what to say here. Many people may be quick to defend Melinda, blaming her actions on her remarkably dark childhood that was filled with abuse and deception, and I'll admit, Melinda had a very, very hard time growing up. So much so that Melinda's story would be enough to fuel a video of her own. But in the end, Melinda's actions and the actions of her friends are inexcusable. There's no denying that Melinda was fully aware of what she was doing, and she was fully aware of the consequences of her choices, but she continued with the crime anyway. But particularly disturbing were the actions of Lori Tackett, as it's rumored that she hadn't even met Shanda until the night that she helped claim her life. I wish there was some sort of silver lining here, but this just isn't one of those cases. I just sincerely hope that while spending all that time behind bars, the girls were able to truly rehabilitate themselves from the awful, disgusting crimes they committed. And maybe somehow they can learn from their terrible choices and become decent people moving forward, however unlikely that may be. It's just terrifying to know that these women are now walking free among us. It was January 8th, 2012. Melinda Coleman was sleeping peacefully in her bed when she was startled awake by the sound of a commotion in her front yard. Without hesitation, she ran to the front door and looked outside. What she saw brought her to her knees. Lying just feet away from her, covered in snow, was her teenage daughter, Daisy. She was unconscious and wearing nothing but a t-shirt and yoga pants. Daisy had been lying here so long that her hair became frozen and stuck to the ground. Melinda ran to get the help of her 3 sons, and together they pulled the girl from the snow and dragged her inside to the warmth of their home. They first tried to warm her up by wrapping blankets around her, but when that didn't work, they placed her in a tub of warm water. That was when her mother noticed the bruises. Daisy was immediately rushed to the hospital for treatment, but when the police arrived, her mother couldn't have prepared herself for what she was about to hear. See, the police were largely unconcerned. In fact, in their eyes, this young girl, she got what she deserved. Considering this story takes place in the small, peaceful town of Maryville, Missouri, it was a story that shocked the entire state when news began to break regarding what had happened to young Daisy Coleman. Daisy had grown up in Missouri with her 3 brothers and her mother, Melinda Coleman, who was a local veterinarian. The children were forced to grow up without a stable father figure in their lives because, tragically, Michael, Daisy's father, lost his life in a car accident when Daisy was about 11 years old. To say that Michael's passing had a profound effect on the family would be a tragic understatement. The loss of Michael nearly tore the family completely apart. The family of 5 had only just begun to recover from Michael's passing when this situation with Daisy reared its ugly head. Prior to the crime, Daisy had been an outgoing, incredibly happy, and carefree young girl. She was incredibly popular in school and was even one of the star cheerleaders. To say that she had it all, well, that'd be putting it lightly. Daisy was a girl that every other girl her age aspired to be. She was surrounded by a flock of close friends, had access to all the cutest guys in her school, and to top it off, her brother was best friends with the school's most popular football player. With all this in mind, it made it all the more shocking when the events of that fateful evening unfolded, leading up to Daisy being found nearly frozen on her front lawn. When Daisy was rushed to the hospital at about 5 a.m. on January 8th, it quickly became clear what had taken place. Doctors and nurses ran to Daisy's side, and from the very beginning, they were certain of one thing. Daisy had been forced against her will and taken advantage of. The evidence was obvious. She had bruises that covered the insides of her legs, proving she'd endured some serious trauma. She was almost completely unconscious, and her alcohol level was 0.13%. The legal limit in Missouri is just 0.08%, so Daisy was nearly double that. But you have to keep in mind, by the time Daisy was taken to the hospital, it's believed it had been about 5 hours since the crime had actually taken place, meaning her alcohol level had been gradually dropping that entire time. So if it was at 0.13% after all this time, you can only imagine how intoxicated she must have been when the crime unfolded. She would have been nearly comatose. When Daisy finally began to regain consciousness a few hours later, it was very clear that she was in no condition to recount the events of that evening. But thankfully, she wasn't the only person present that night when the crime unfolded. Daisy's close friend, Paige Parkhurst, stepped up and helped police better understand what had taken place that night. Paige appeared to have been profoundly affected by the events of that evening. When she spoke with investigators about the night in question, she seemed a bit distant and was clearly rattled. Still, she managed to tell detectives that she and Daisy had been invited to a small party at the home of Maryville's star football player, Matt Barnett. She recalls that Daisy had gotten the phone number of Matt, and the two were texting back and forth throughout the evening. Now, some sources say that the two had been flirting between one another, but I haven't been able to 100% confirm this. Either way, during their conversation, Daisy learned that Matt was having a small get-together at his parents' house in the basement. The only thing was, his parents didn't know about it. It was just a small gathering between Matt and a few of his friends, nothing crazy, and Matt asked the two girls if they wanted to come. Obviously, with Matt being the most popular guy in school, the girls jumped at the opportunity. No sooner than the girls arrived at this party, though, they grew a bit nervous because they quickly realized they were the only two girls in attendance that night. This definitely put them on edge a little bit, but nothing about the party seemed too crazy. It was just a bunch of teenagers getting together to share some laughs amongst their friends. But then the alcohol came out. Shortly after they arrived, Paige says that the host of the party, Matt Barnett, started pushing drinks on Daisy. Paige seems to have suggested that prior to this night, neither she nor Daisy had ever had alcohol before. But not wanting to disappoint their peers, they both accepted drinks and vowed to have a good time. They were both ushered to the basement, where they were told to stay quiet so as not to wake up Matt's parents. And this was the moment when everything changed. Paige says that as the door to the basement shut behind them, she realized what was really going on here. Just minutes later, without any warning, one of the boys grabbed Paige by the hand and forced her into a nearby room. And when he shut the door, well, things didn't go the way Paige had planned. She was taken advantage of, and considering this boy was far, far larger than her, she was helpless to stop it. When the event was finally over and Paige was able to break free, she took off into the other room and quickly noticed Daisy was nowhere to be found. Matt Barnett was missing as well. Paige made her way to one of the only other rooms in the basement, and that's when she found both Matt and Daisy. Tragically, Daisy was in the midst of suffering the same fate as Paige. It didn't take long before Matt exited the room, seemingly clear-headed and perfectly coherent, almost looking as though he was proud of what he had done. When Daisy finally stumbled to the doorway, it was clear she was not in a good place.
Nope, she wasn't.
She wasn't able to stand up on her own without assistance, and she was more or less limp due to the amount of alcohol she had consumed by this point. We don't know how much alcohol she consumed willingly and how much was forced on her by the boys at the party, but needless to say, she was wildly drunk and had no idea what was going on. Almost immediately after Daisy exited the room, barely even conscious, the girls were then led to a car and taken home. The boys drove the girls back to Daisy's house, where the two had been having a sleepover before sneaking out for this party. As soon as they pulled up in front of the house, the boys told Paige to go on inside and get some sleep. They said that they would take care of Daisy and make sure that she made it in. Paige believed them and headed back inside, going to bed, fully believing Daisy would be inside just a minute or two later. As soon as Paige's head hit the pillow, she was out like a light. She only awoke hours later when she heard the commotion caused by Daisy's mother and brothers bringing her inside from the cold. No one knows just how many hours had passed since Paige had gone inside that night, but considering Daisy's hair was frozen solid and stuck to the ground beneath her, it's safe to assume she'd spent an incredibly long time out in the cold. It would eventually be discovered that after Paige made it inside that night, the boys just pulled Daisy from the car, then tossed her onto the front lawn in the middle of the snow, speeding away from the scene so as not to get caught in the act. They could not have cared less about her if they tried. And after Paige revealed all of this to the police, Daisy's brother Charlie opened up and said that he knew Paige was telling the truth because he'd found Daisy's phone buried in the snow near where she'd been dumped. When he looked through her text messages, he found that she'd been having flirtatious conversations with Matt Barnett, a guy who, up until this point, he'd considered to be one of his closest friends. Considering he knew Matt better than anyone, he knew what he was capable of. But the police, well, they weren't buying it.
Hello, you need to know this. I ain't no Spice Girl. Do you know what girl power means to me? Sarah Vaughan, Lauryn Hill. That's real girl power, mate.
And how are the numbers looking? We're landing at a strong 70. SPF.
Thanks to JetBlue's low fares, Kayla's in vacation mode already.
After Paige told her story to investigators, they called Matt Barnett down to the station for questioning. Needless to say, Matt's version of events was completely different from what Paige had said. According to Matt, he didn't simply invite Daisy and Paige over that evening. According to him, Daisy had begged him for an invite to their get-together, and he seems to have only agreed because he found her attractive. He also claims that Daisy had been slightly drunk when she arrived at the party, and this statement may have actually been true because Paige admitted later on that she and Daisy had snuck a few sips of alcohol from Daisy's mother's liquor cabinet just moments before sneaking out to go to the party, trying to loosen themselves up and not embarrass themselves in front of Matt. According to Matt, when the girls arrived at the party, Daisy agreed to follow him to the bedroom before she'd ever even been handed a drink. He insists that their actions were consensual, and Daisy only began drinking after the relations were over. He made it painfully clear that Daisy knew exactly what she was getting herself into, and that she had been a willing participant. But the more he shared his version of events, the more things changed. See, at first, he claimed he didn't know the name of the girl that had tagged along with Daisy that night. But just a few moments later, he referred to her by name, Paige. He also claimed to have never given Daisy a drink until after they had relations. But again, moments later, he admitted to giving her a few drinks to, quote, break the ice. What's insane about this whole ordeal is that the officer who was conducting the interview with Matt was totally unconcerned, and he made that incredibly clear. In fact, at one point during the interview, the officer can be seen lounging in his chair, hands behind his head, as if shooting the breeze with a close friend. When Matthew admitted to dropping Daisy off on her front lawn that evening, literally tossing her into a pile of snow, the officer didn't even question it. He actually applauded Matt for making sure she made it home, quote, safely. If this weren't bad enough, one of the other boys who'd been present that evening, Jordan Zek, admitted that he'd filmed the relations between Daisy and Matt that evening, capturing the footage through a small crack in the doorway. But interestingly, as soon as the police asked to take a look at this footage, it had miraculously been deleted. Why he deleted the footage, well, that's never been explained. But I think it's clear to see that Jordan was most likely covering for his friend. Thankfully, despite the fact that the police had largely been blowing the whole thing off and doing their best to sweep it under the rug, they finally agreed to act on the situation. Before the sun had set that evening, police arrested Matt Barnett, Jordan Zek, and another boy who's never been named. But unfortunately, things wouldn't be that easy. By this point, Daisy had begun to wake up. And the story she told investigators, well, it wasn't pretty. When we hear about awful stories like this, it can be easy to forget that we can all end up in bad situations sometimes. Whether it's a night out with friends that suddenly goes horribly wrong, or if it's a simple mistake we've made that alters the course of our day or even our lives. The best way to keep ourselves out of dangerous situations is to keep our wits about us. But for some of us, we may need a little extra help doing that. This is where I place my trust in Magic Mind, an awesome mental performance shot that helps me feel a lot more focused and certainly provides a much-needed boost of energy. Magic Mind has nearly everything you could want to 10 years, and all of the mushrooms are undeniable. Now, your focus. And it's certain to make by visiting magicmind.com's first guarantee. If you as Daisy finally began to come to her senses, she could remember what had unfolded that evening. She didn't remember many details at all, but she did remember drinking before sneaking out of her home that night, then being given copious amounts of alcohol after arriving at the party. Unfortunately, she didn't realize that she had overindulged until it was far too late. She couldn't recall having any sort of relationship with Matt that evening, and the only clear image of that evening that she could remember was a dog jumping on her lap while she was sitting on the couch. Seconds later, she passed out. Now, for anyone with half a brain, you know that Daisy's version of events clearly proves that from the moment she arrived at the party, she was not in control of her body. This alone should prove that Matt almost certainly took advantage of her that night. There was no way that he did, especially if she was already drunk the moment she arrived, as she would later admit. Even though Matt denied all of the charges that were placed against him, his Fred, one who's never been named, confessed to what he had done to Paige that evening. He pleaded guilty in court and recalled every detail of that night, including every time Paige begged him to stop, and she repeatedly told him no. In the end, he was spend time in a juvenile facility, but Matt wasn't going down that fight. He denied everything from the beginning, and even made sure to tell all of his friends and peers that Daisy was nothing more than a liar. With the intention of putting this whole situation behind and letting the law decide how things should play out, Daisy then made the incredibly brave call to return to school while the investigation was carried out. She'd hoped that her friends and peers would support her and back her up on her allegations against Matt. But nothing could have been further from the truth. When Daisy arrived back at school, it seemed as though the entire student body had turned against her. In stark contrast to her expectations, everybody was being supportive of Matt, not Daisy. She was subjected to every type of bullying you could imagine because everyone believed that she had made the whole thing up. The thing is, in the small community of Maryville, Matt's family name was known far and wide. His whole family was known for being the best of men in everything they did.
It should sound better now.
So it seemed unfathomable.
I think I may have fixed the problem. I'm gonna go check. Be right back.
Considering the influence his family had over the town, well, it's easy to see why everyone sided with Matt.
Making these boo-boos.
As a result, Daisy lost most of her childhood friends who'd now turned their back on her. She was labeled every offensive name that you could think of, and no one wanted anything to do with her anymore. Daisy's brother Charlie, who was supremely popular at the school and had formerly been best friends with Matt, was pretty much the only person who tried to protect her from the hate and the bullying. He took every opportunity to explain that he had proof that Daisy's allegations were true, but no one wanted to hear it. In a matter of days, Daisy was merely a fragment of her former self. She lost all of her friends, she lost every bit of her popularity, and worse yet, she had to live in a world where no one believed a word she said. If this weren't bad enough, the Maryville town sheriff, Darren White, had spoken up and made it painfully clear he didn't believe Daisy either. He repeatedly claimed that his sympathy was with Matt, who was being held against his will for crimes he didn't commit. Sheriff White wanted more than anything to have these charges dropped and move on with his career. But in his eyes, these two lying girls simply wouldn't let that happen. When Sheriff White was later confronted with the idea that he may be wrong and the girls may be telling the truth, he literally laughed. He believed that the girls were simply doing it for attention, even though Paige's assailant had already confessed, been charged, and sent to juvenile detention. If this wasn't bad enough, he even took to insulting Daisy's mother, Melinda, claiming that Melinda loved being able to play the victim and get sympathy from her peers. Remember, this is a widowed single mother who was simply doing the best she could to keep her family together less than 3 years after the tragic loss of her husband and the horrific assault of her daughter. At what point in time are you allowed to be a victim if not in this exact situation? But if you could imagine, the worst was yet to come. After several months of being told that a court date would be set very soon, the Coleman family finally received news from the local authorities. They were excited to hear what kind of development had taken place in the case. But that's when they were told every charge against both Matt and Jordan, the boy who filmed the ordeal, had been dropped. Nothing else would be done, and both boys were free to return to their daily lives. The reason the police were able to do this was because of a slip of the tongue on Daisy's part. When Daisy was first coming out of her drunken days in the hospital, the officers posed a loaded question. Is there any chance that you may have told the boys that you would exchange sexual favors for alcohol? Daisy replied, quote, "I guess," and that was the end of it. The legal team used this statement against her and had the entire case dismissed. Paige, who was coherent the entire evening, claimed she'd never witnessed such a phrase leave Daisy's mouth. But it was pointless. The damage was done and the case was closed. The thing you have to keep in mind is that Daisy didn't even remember anything from that night. So her response of, "I guess," was nothing more than an honest assessment of the situation, not a suggestion or admission of guilt. Think of it like this. I hand you a sealed cardboard box, and I ask you, is there a chance there's a cat inside this box?
There's a chance.
Well, the only honest answer would be, sure, I guess. You have no idea what's inside the box, any more than Daisy had any idea what was going on in that basement.
That night.
At this point, many people began to wonder if Matt's grandfather may have played a part in having these charges dropped. See, his grandfather was a former cop and a state representative.
Oh, wow.
So to say that he had some pull with the Maryville Police Department would be an understatement. I honestly can't find the words to describe just how much of an influence the Barnetts had over this small town. It's truly sickening. At this point, for Daisy, her life was essentially ruined. She faced relentless bullying, both online and in person, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. This led her to attempt to take her own life 4 times. She became so fragile and such a danger to herself that her family removed the door from her bedroom so that they could always keep an eye on her. I can't believe I'm saying this, but somehow things still managed to get worse from here, because while the family were away one evening, someone actually set their home on fire. Thankfully, no one was harmed, but the Coleman family vowed this was the end of the road. They packed up what was left of their belongings and left the city, moving several miles away to a neighboring town with a different police force and a whole new set of faces, finally giving themselves a fresh start. It was around this same time that Daisy's case started to gain attention on a national scale, and it didn't take long before an underground group of hackers learned of the criminal mischief that Sheriff White was up to, and they promised to put an end to it. A team of hackers known as Anonymous stepped up, and they didn't just ask for the case to be reopened, they demanded it. Their historic tagline sent chills down the spine of the Maryville Police Department and everyone involved in the investigation. "We are anonymous. We are legion. We do not forgive. We do not forget." For those of you who may not be aware, Anonymous is a group of people that you don't want to mess with. No one even knows how many members of Anonymous there are, but each and every one of them is the best of the best when it comes to hacking. These people will find out information about you that you yourself probably didn't even know. They took on a similar case from Ohio and managed to hack into the personal social media accounts of various high school students who were connected to an eerily similar crime that took place there, exposing not only their personal information, but also private chats, photos, and videos, each of which confirmed the involvement of many students who police didn't even consider to be suspects at that time. When Anonymous took on Daisy's case, the Maryville police knew they had messed up. When they demanded justice for Daisy, Missouri state authorities finally knew they had to step in and do something. Soon afterward, they announced that a new prosecutor would be taking a look at the investigation and re-examining the evidence. But unfortunately, there simply wasn't enough here to lead to a conviction, or even lead to new charges. The police had Daisy cornered. That one statement she made while still stuck in a drunken stupor had tainted the entire case. There was simply nothing that could be done. Thankfully, Matt was finally held accountable for something, though. While he couldn't be charged for taking advantage of Daisy, he was charged and convicted for dumping her in the snow that evening. But still, he didn't spend a single night in jail. He was given 2 years probation and a 4-month suspended sentence. He also had to pay $1,800 in restitution to the Coleman family, as if that actually did anything. After all was said and done, Daisy somehow managed to continue pushing herself through high school, and eventually even got a scholarship to Missouri Valley College. She later decided to get as far away from her haunting past as she possibly could, opting to move to Colorado to begin life anew as a tattoo artist. By this point, she was suffering severely with PTSD. She wanted so desperately to get away from the ghosts of her past. But no matter how fast she ran, tragedy was lurking just around the corner. In June of 2018, as Daisy was packing up her things and moving homes, her mother and brother offered to help her with the move. Her brother Tristan was riding with Melinda, their mother, when they were involved in a single car accident. Melinda was severely injured but made it out. Tristan did not. He lost his life immediately upon impact, leaving yet another dark hole in this family's history. But by this point in the story, you have to realize there's several minutes of this video left, and the story of the Coleman family is far from over. In the years following the horrific ordeal that Daisy had endured, she decided the only way to move past this was to share her story with others as a warning. She didn't want what happened to her to ever happen to any other child on this planet. She started speaking much more openly about her traumatic past and appeared in various interviews and speaking events to share her message. But by the summer of 2020, Daisy's past had finally caught up with her. At around 4 in the afternoon on August 4th, 2020, Melinda called in the Denver police and asked them to perform a welfare check on Daisy because she'd been incredibly depressed and hadn't heard from her in a while. When officers showed up, everything seemed fine. As a precaution, a crisis prevention agent stayed behind for a good while to better assess the situation and ensure that Daisy was safe. He left later on that evening. No sooner than he drove away, Daisy claimed her own life. She was pronounced deceased at the age of just 23 at 8:30 that evening. When Sheriff White found out about Daisy claiming her life, it seems he had a change of heart and finally admitted he may have been wrong all those years ago. At least that's the story I wish I could share. As it would turn out, Sheriff White doubled down on his stance against Daisy. In fact, it was election season, and he was running to be re-elected as the town's sheriff. In one of his speeches, if you could even imagine, this man took to the stage and proclaimed that Daisy decided to take her life at this particular moment as a way to spite him, bringing her story back into the spotlight and ruining his chances of winning the re-election. This man literally said this. Praise God, this man lost the election by a landslide. But still, the story isn't over. 4 months after Daisy claimed her own life, her mother took to social media, posting several remembrances of her daughter. It's safe to say at this moment she wasn't just thinking about Daisy, though. I feel certain that memories of Tristan, as well as her late husband, must have been flooding her mind. Because right after posting to social media, she too took her own life.
Caroline Crouch.
Carolyn Crouch was just 19 years old when a trio of criminals broke into her home that she shared with her husband. These criminals ambushed Carolyn, tying up her husband and leaving him to watch the crime unfold. After the crime took place, Carolyn and her beloved 7-month-old puppy had both lost their lives, leaving only Carolyn's husband and their infant daughter behind. The crime that was left behind shook the entire country of Greece, and investigators couldn't understand what the couple could have been in possession of that would have been so valuable to warrant such a vicious and heartless crime. But that's when they realized there was much more to this story than meets the eye. Investigators and prosecutors soon uncovered a plethora of evidence that no one could have expected, landing one man in prison for the rest of his life. Before we get started with today's video, I want to let you know about an amazing new game called Love and Pies. Love and Pies is a free-to-download mobile game that can be played either on your mobile phone or tablet. It's a sudden disappearance, taking you down a rabbit hole of small-town gossip and the best aspects of this game. Crouch was born and raised in the UK for much of her childhood. Her transition to Greece isn't very well documented, and her parents haven't shared too many details about Carolyn's personal life and upbringing. One source stated that Carolyn moved to Greece when she was just 8 years old, but we don't know what prompted such an unexpected move. Some sources suggest that Carolyn's father remained in the UK for much of Carolyn's life, so it's probably safe to assume that her father and mother must have split up at some point, but other sources claim that Carolyn moved to Greece alongside both her mother and father. So what caused Carolyn to end up in Greece? Well, we really don't know. Most of the sources I found claim that she moved there with both of her parents, so that's the version of events that we'll run with here. Just know that that may not be completely accurate. But either way, Carolyn spent the majority of her childhood years in Greece, following Greek customs and being raised in a traditionally Greek lifestyle. And this, believe it or not, is what caused things to get a bit weird, at least from an American's perspective. See, Carolyn was the daughter of a retired engineer, with some sources claiming that this engineering experience was spent working with oil and gas companies, suggesting her father had quite a reasonable income for much of Carolyn's life. And when looking at some of the photos of Carolyn's later years, it certainly seems that the family lived a pretty comfortable lifestyle. And that's what makes this next series of events seem rather unusual. I'm sure most of us are familiar with two things. The first being that love has no age limits. That's just a simple fact. The second is that around the world, many cultures will marry for financial or political gain. Keep both of these things in mind, and we'll get back to this in just a moment. When Carolyn was entering her teenage years, she'd been considering what she planned on doing for the rest of her life. She'd been actively attending school and was doing quite well for herself, but that's when she met a man named Babis. Carolyn met Babis when she was just 15 years old, sometime in 2017. The two hit it off, but I can't, for the life of me, understand how. Like I said, Carolyn was 15 at the time, still presumably living with her parents. But Babis was 29 when they met, twice her age, and Carolyn was still a minor. Now, there may be some sort of cultural difference here that I just don't understand, hence why I suggested that this just seems a bit odd, specifically from an American perspective. But keep in mind, in Greece, just like in America, you can't legally marry until you're 18. So by all means, Babis was in an intimate relationship with an underage girl, and her parents were totally fine with this. We know that her parents were aware of this unusual relationship because in 2019, just 2 years later, the two got married. Even at this point, Carolyn was still underage, meaning her parents needed to sign the documents to allow this marriage to take place. Now, I'm not going to judge someone for a situation I don't fully understand due to potential cultural differences, but this just seems a bit off to me. As mentioned, love has no age limits, but if you want my opinion, that rule only applies if you're of a legal age, not still considered a child. Either way, Carolyn and Babis were married, and everything seemed great afterward. The two appeared to be very happily in love, and everything was going well, at least to the outside world. See, behind closed doors, things were not at all what they seemed. Allegations of abuse had begun to run rampant, and to this day, we still don't know whose allegations were more closely aligned with reality. But things were about to change for the Crouch family, and in ways no one could have ever seen coming. The following version of events has been told from the perspective of David Crouch, Carolyn's father. This story has been passed along by him as being completely truthful. So for the sake of this video, I'll be presenting it in the same way, but in the interest of full transparency, this exact series of events has not been proven, at least not as far as I can tell. David says that Carolyn and Babis would frequently go to a local restaurant near Athens. They'd been to the restaurant countless times in the past, and it was one of their favorite places to visit. As time passed by, Babis would become close friends with the owner of the restaurant, a man who's never been named publicly. At this same point in time, Babis was a helicopter operator, and it was a job he seems to have been quite proud of. Babis was a very confident pilot, seemingly with many hours under his belt, and anyone who knew him knew that being a pilot wasn't just a job for Babis, it was part of his identity.
Prestige.
Naturally, as Babis and the restaurant owner spoke time and time again, Babis's time spent working as a pilot was a frequent topic of their conversations. But one day, these conversations took a dark turn that no one could have seen coming. According to David Crouch, the restaurant owner began to speak to Babis about his secret business that involved smuggling illegal goods all around the country. This restaurant owner was deeply, deeply involved in this business. In fact, it may have been the whole reason behind him owning the restaurant in the first place. After all, what better way to clean dirty money than to funnel it through a highly profitable business? David says that the restaurant owner approached Babis and told him about a gang that he'd been involved with. The gang had recently been dealing with some pipeline issues, so to speak, and he felt that Babis would be the perfect man to fix these issues. With Babis's easy access to helicopters, there would be no better way to smuggle goods around the country than through the air. This would keep the police off the trail of any potential drops, as sniffer dogs and drug enforcement agents can't really patrol the air, at least not very easily. Babis, whether willingly or by coercion, allegedly agreed to this business endeavor, and in the process struck up a deal with the devil. Babis seemingly had no idea that this job would take everything from him, including his wife and daughter. According to David Crouch, Babis was, quote, very stupid. While Babis may have been an excellent pilot, he didn't have a good sense of business, nor did he know about keeping people on a need-to-know basis. So instead of keeping his mouth shut about his new shady business deal, he told Carolyn about it, essentially sealing her fate. Now, I'm sure most of us are familiar with this idea, but anytime someone conducts shady business deals, it's always the best practice to never tell anyone about it. That's just common knowledge. This isn't usually done in an attempt to lie to the people you love, but rather to keep them safe. After all, if they don't know anything about your crimes, they won't be the ones to go down when the ship inevitably sinks. This keeps your family and loved ones at a safe distance from anything going on, so that if things do start to go south, you're the only one that has to atone for what you've done, not them. But Babis didn't seem to have understood this concept, because as soon as he struck up the deal with the restaurant owner, Carolyn was the first person that he told. Naturally, being a good person, Carolyn wasn't okay with this new line of work. Yet it was going to bring in a massive sum of money for the small family, but it wasn't money that Carolyn was interested in accepting. She fought back against these plans every chance she got, but there was little she could do to stop her husband. Worse yet, there was even less that she could do to stop her husband's new employers. When Carolyn realized that her words had no weight in the eyes of her husband, Carolyn's father says that Carolyn started to walk out on Babis. Babis couldn't stand by and watch this happen, but the problem was, Babis's new employers weren't willing to sit by and watch this happen either. Thus, they forced Babis to silence his wife once and for all. David Crouch says that all of this was revealed to him in a handwritten letter that was given to him by Babis while Babis was incarcerated. David says that Babis wanted to set the record straight once and for all, and he felt that Carolyn's father deserved to know the truth. But for many people, this so-called truth was just a bit too much to believe, especially considering that Babis had told a dramatically different story up to this point. In fact, Babis's attorney says that this entire story is nothing more than a fabrication on the part of Carolyn's father. And he even goes on to claim that such a letter was never handed over to David because that letter doesn't even exist. And according to Babis's public statements, he wasn't involved in the crime at all. In reality, he was just another victim. It was May 11th, 2021. It was a day like any other for Babis and Carolyn. That is, until nighttime rolled around. At some point in the middle of the night, a trio of armed robbers broke into the couple's home, which at the time was occupied by Carolyn, Babis, their 7-month-old husky puppy, and their infant daughter, Lydia. When the three broke into the home, they immediately grabbed the puppy and heartbreakingly ended its life using its own leash. Once this was done, the three made their way upstairs where they pulled out weapons and demanded all the money that the couple had to offer. Babis told the men that they had about 10,000 euros and even told them where to find the money. But Carolyn wasn't going to let them take it without a fight. Carolyn had been trained in martial arts, and she began to fight back against the robbers. But when they began to resist, they threatened little Lydia, who'd been in the room with the couple that evening. The leader of the three robbers managed to overpower Carolyn after making threats against her child, then ended her life by restricting her breathing, leaving her on the couple's bed and fleeing the home. But before they left, they tied up Babis and gagged him, with him fainting just a few minutes later. This all took place around 4:30 a.m., and when Babis eventually woke up, he managed to free himself from his restraints and call the police for help. When officers arrived at the scene, initially everything that Babis had told them seemed to have been true. Unfortunately, when they checked the home security camera for evidence, they found that the robbers had stolen the SD card, meaning that nothing was left behind outside of an obvious mess and a disturbing crime scene. The Crouch family and Babis would later mourn the loss of Carolyn, with photos from the funeral showing Babis embracing Carolyn's mother as she wept. But just a few weeks later, police would reach a breakthrough in the case, finding new information that would turn the investigation on its head and paint Babis in a much different light. As investigators were doing their best to get to the bottom of the awful crime that transpired in the couple's home that night, they began to notice some inconsistencies in Babis's story. Police requested access to Carolyn's phone on the night of her passing, in an effort to better pin down her final moments and what took place leading up to the crime, likely in an effort to find out if she'd been in contact with anyone suspicious in the days or weeks leading up to her demise. It was when searching through her phone that they gained access to her fitness data. This is when things get very interesting. So if you have a modern smartphone or smartwatch, you should know that your devices are always collecting data on you. Most of us think of this as purely being your location data, but if you have a smartwatch, such as an Apple Watch, then your phone is also documenting things such as your heart rate, your physical movements, and in some cases even your temperature or other details about your health. When investigators looked into Carolyn's health data, they found something interesting. According to her health data that was pulled from her Apple Watch, which documented her sleep patterns, Carolyn had been fast asleep immediately before losing her life. Worse yet, her location data showed that she never once got out of bed, which was inconsistent with what Babis told investigators about Carolyn doing her best to physically fight off the assailants using martial arts. To make matters worse, Babis also claimed that the attack had taken place sometime around 4:30 a.m. But investigators learned from their home security system that the memory card had been removed at precisely 1:20 a.m., more than 3 hours before Babis claims that the crime began. Carolyn's Apple Watch also showed that her heart stopped beating at about 4:20 a.m., again disputing the timeline that Babis had claimed. With all of this information taken into account, police theorized that from 1:20 a.m. to 4:20 a.m., Babis had been staging the scene of the crime. They believe he made multiple attempts on Carolyn's life during this time, making sure to cover his tracks along the way, to make sure that things appear as though there was a break-in. But the bigger question here that many of us are wondering is, why? Well, that's the problem. There are multiple answers, depending on which version of events you believe. Was Babis truly threatened by an elusive gang member? If so, then he probably took his wife's life because he was told to. Did Carolyn truly find out about Babis's smuggling crimes and threaten to leave, sending him into a fit of rage? Well, that's certainly possible too. But in more recent accounts from Babis during his trial, he even claimed that the marriage between the two had been filled with physical abuse. He claimed that his reason for taking Carolyn's life was because he was sick of her assaulting him, referencing several occasions in which she would punch and kick him when things didn't go her way. He says that he grew so tired of this that he smothered Carolyn with her own pillow while she slept. But if this were true, then why did he also take the life of her dog? That part just seems excessive. If you want my personal opinion, I think the guy's just a cold-blooded monster. He likely had a million different reasons that he was able to justify in his own mind, none of which hold water when you look at them from a logical perspective.
Nope.
Ultimately, though, none of these theories matter. The only thing that we know for sure is that Babis was, in fact, responsible for taking the life of his wife, regardless of his reasons. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 11 years for the crimes against Carolyn's dog, though unfortunately his so-called life sentence only lasts around 20 years. He's expected to remain behind bars until he's in his 50s, at which point he'll be eligible for parole. In the aftermath of the crime and Babis's conviction, Carolyn's family has been highly critical of the investigation and the allegations that Babis has made. Carolyn's father in particular believes that there's much more to the story than Babis is letting on. And considering Babis has changed his version of events at least 3 times since his initial interrogation, there's a good chance that Carolyn's father may be right. We may never know just how deep this rabbit hole really goes.
This cream is basically a Botox alternative for the Purity Woods age-defying dream cream. It's all natural, USDA certified organic, and there's this cool ingredient in it called maple leaf extract. It tightens your skin just like Botox, but it's all natural and plant-based. Look at how smooth it goes on. Gives my skin this instant glow.
Thank you, God, 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 thank you, God.
Laura Babcock had a life that was seemingly perfect. She'd just gotten a college degree, was surrounded by friends who loved her, and she was on the path to secure the job of her dreams. But all of that changed when she got unexpectedly involved in a love triangle that she couldn't get out of. Laura was blissfully unaware that the man that she'd fallen for had a series of incredibly dark secrets that he'd been keeping from her. Investigators claimed that Laura was subjected to an unspeakable crime, and it ultimately resulted in her losing her life and being disposed of in the most creative yet heartless way you could imagine. Detectives spent months collecting evidence and investigating this crime, and in the end, 2 criminals were placed behind bars. But they're not anyone you would have expected. This is a story that is bizarre from beginning to end. This is the twisted case of Laura Babcock. Before we keep going with today's story, I want to let you guys know about the sponsor of today's video. About your parent, I was able to trade from this, even before offer a feature to colorize these photos, bringing new life to these people that have long since passed. It's a super cool service, so I'd strongly urge you guys to check it out. If you click the link in the description, you'll not only be given a 14-day trial, but you'll also get 50% off your membership. Give it a try and let me know what you find. You never know, we may actually be related somewhere along the line. Thanks to MyHeritage for sponsoring today's video. Laura Babcock was just 23 years old in the summer of 2012. Laura had a core group of friends that she depended on, as well as a family who cared deeply for her. She was known for having the most sincere love for dogs, but she also had aspirations of starting her own family one day, and eventually settling down with someone she loved. Laura's personality was described pretty interestingly by one reporter who recalled her as being the perfect mixture of optimistic and conflicted. Laura was a strong young woman, but she also had a few demons. Laura had struggled with her mental health in the past, but she was on the path to making things better for herself.
Just out of
In
respect for you,
2012, she just graduated from college and got a degree in English as well as drama. She'd been attending the University of Toronto for a number of years and was super excited to finally put her life as a student behind her so that she could get to work on her career. She'd been spending her time searching for a more permanent job where she could begin to place her roots and grow. But she quickly learned that finding an honest, good-paying job isn't as easy as some people make it seem. After spending quite some time trying to find a suitable position and being unable to do so, Laura started to get impatient.
Oh boy.
Worse yet, she began having disagreements with her parents. Although Laura was 23 and equipped with a solid education, she continued to live at home with her parents while she tried to make ends meet. Her parents were happy to have her, but they had strict rules that she was expected to follow. This was the cliche situation of stay at home as long as you want, but if you live under my roof, you live by my rules. Laura respected this to a certain extent, but tensions began to rise when Laura began to push back on her parents' rules about curfew. She'd missed curfew multiple times in the past, and this was beginning to be a problem for her parents. Rather than agreeing to her parents' rules, Laura decided that enough was enough and she'd moved out on her own. Well, sort of. She moved out, but she wasn't entirely on her own just yet.
In the backyard?
She wasn't able to afford her own place to stay, so she opted to hop from couch to couch, bouncing between the homes of her various friends. While this certainly isn't a great lifestyle decision, Laura just needed some space and time away from her parents while she tried to establish herself as her own person. Her father clarified that she'd not been banished from their home due to her curfew violations, but he made it clear that he didn't approve of her coming home at 2 or 3 in the morning multiple times a week, which is when Laura eventually opted to just move out. Without a job and desperate for money, one of Laura's friends introduced her to a new idea. While waiting for a more traditional job that utilizes her degree, why not try joining the escort business? To put it plainly, an escort is someone who's paid for their companionship. Escort services are widely available to people of all genders and walks of life, and most of the time it just involves accompanying someone to an event, or just paying the person to hang out with you and be friendly. But sometimes escort services require more than simple friendship, depending on the client's requirements and requests. Laura was apprehensive about this line of work, but she knew that she needed money, and she needed it quickly. So she opted to give it a try. Those around Laura noticed that pretty soon after she joined this particular workforce, her mood began to change. Her father recalls this time in her life and says that it was clear that Laura was growing frustrated. He said she always seemed agitated and on edge and would have a hard time staying still. One of her friends recalled her time working as an escort and said that Laura had a lot of emotional issues, but that they understood each other. And overall, Laura was a happy and outgoing person. But by the spring of 2012, that had begun to change. A darkness had begun to envelop Laura, and there was nothing her family could do to stop it. By July of that year, Laura stopped contacting her family, and soon after, she was never heard from again.
Oh my God.
It quickly became clear to those around her that Laura had been hiding some dark secrets from those that she held closest. Laura's boss, the owner of Last Minute Escorts, recalled that Laura had big aspirations of becoming an actress. He remembered Laura fondly, explaining that she worked for him multiple times in the past. Outside of this, 3 other men spoke up about their time working with Laura. All 3 men agreed that they'd never had intimate relations with her. Their business was purely professional. But a couple of other people she worked with weren't as open about the time they spent with Laura, leaving a lot of room for speculation. One of her former clients was a TV and film producer who let Laura stay at his house for at least 2 weeks. Another of her clients was a doctor who offered to help Laura pay for an apartment so that she could be on her own. But both this doctor and all of Laura's other clients stopped hearing from her in early July of 2012. It was around this same time that a man named Dylan Millard reappeared in Laura's life. Dylan and Laura went way back. They met back in 2008 and dated for a short while before calling things off. Dylan was incredibly well off, financially speaking. He's often described as a millionaire and was the heir to the thriving business Millard Air, which is an aviation company based out of Toronto. When Lauren and Dylan met, they hit it off instantly. They would share an on-again, off-again relationship before eventually losing contact sometime in early 2009. By 2010, Laura had moved on and met a new man named Sean Lerner. Sean and Laura shared a much deeper relationship and dated for about a year and a half before things were broken off around Christmas of 2011. We'll get back to Sean in just a minute, but around the same time that the relationship had begun to fall apart, Laura was struggling pretty seriously. She'd been admitted to a hospital in August of 2011 after she confessed to doctors that she felt as though she cried all hours of the day and was suffering from serious bouts of depression and anxiety. But it's never been publicly revealed why she was having these issues. It's possible that she was simply coming to terms with the fact that her relationship was falling apart, but it's also possible that there were deeper issues here that just haven't been shared publicly. Laura eventually confessed that she'd begun to harm herself, and that's when doctors began to take her case a bit more seriously, with one report suggesting that she began taking antidepressant medication as a result. By April of 2012, about 6 or 7 months later, Laura had returned to the hospital at least 12 more times due to various mental health issues. Laura was losing it, and she was spiraling quickly. Her friends began to grow increasingly concerned, but there was very little that they could do, other than just be there for her and comfort her. To make matters even worse, this is when Dylan Millard came back into the picture. While Dylan and Laura had broken up about 4 years prior, they still kept in touch from time to time. With Laura now being single, she decided to reach back out to Dylan to see if there was anything left between the two of them. And as luck would have it, there was. But there was also a catch. Dylan had begun dating someone about a year prior to this, sometime in early 2011. His new girlfriend, Christina, was a bit of an interesting character. She and Laura had multiple arguments, and what it ultimately boiled down to was Christina being jealous of the bond that Laura and Dylan shared. It was clear that there was something special between the two of them, and Christina felt threatened by this. To make matters even worse, Dylan and Christina weren't even in a committed relationship. While they were technically together, Dylan says that they were in an open relationship, and he claims that Christina was aware that he was actively sleeping with other people, one of these people being Laura. In February of 2012, Laura turned 23, and on her birthday she received a text from Christina. The text read, "Happy birthday. A year ago today was the first time I slept with Dylan." Laura, seemingly unfazed by this, responded by saying, "That's fine, I slept with him a couple weeks ago." It was clear from this moment on there was some serious bad blood between the two, but Dylan wanted no part of it. It would seem that Dylan wasn't looking to reignite anything serious with Laura. This became clear when he texted her a short while later and explained that he felt that Laura was a bad influence for him. He requested that she not contact him anymore until she'd made a, quote, huge leap of self-discovery. He concluded this by saying, "As I said before, good luck with life." It was very clear that Dylan was done with Laura, but Laura's version of events paints a different picture. While Dylan claims that Christina knew about his promiscuity, Laura doesn't believe that Christina knew the extent of Dylan's actions. A text that she sent to another friend named Andrew suggests that Dylan was cheating on Christina behind her back, and the two weren't actually in an open relationship. Laura seems to have regretted hooking up with Dylan to an extent, because she believed he and Christina were on the same page, but would soon learn after that they weren't. I'll spare you all of the he said, she said drama and cut to the chase. In April of 2012, Christina had had enough. She wanted Laura out of their lives for good, and Dylan admitted that he was willing to make that happen. He texted Christina and told him that he'd take care of Laura. He didn't even beat around the bush about it. When Christina asked what he planned to do, he said, quote, "First I'm going to hurt her, then I'll make her leave. I will remove her from our lives." By June of 2012, Sean Lerner, the man who Laura had been dating for about a year and a half, stepped back into her life. He'd heard about how bad off she was, and he wanted to do his best to help her. The two had no plans of getting back together, but Sean still cared for Laura deeply and wanted to help her get back on her feet. Sean had also learned that Laura had begun working for last-minute escorts. When he found out about how bad of shape she was in, he paid for her to stay in a motel for a few days and even gave her an iPad so that she could look for apartments in the area. When he pressed Laura about her involvement in the escort business, she repeatedly assured him that her business was not of a sexual nature, and that she was nothing more than arm candy for lonely men. Sean says that he still believes there was more to it than this. If this weren't bad enough, several of Laura's friends also explained that around the same time, they have reason to believe that Laura had developed an addiction to illegal substances. Laura, to put it lightly, was not having a good time. You can't help but feel terrible for her after everything she'd been through. But at the same time, we also have to admit, Laura was an adult, capable of making adult decisions. It seems that she just kept making one bad decision after another, and it led her down a path that quickly became too treacherous to come back from. All throughout this time, despite Laura's claims that she didn't want to be involved with Dylan, and despite his claims that he didn't want to be involved with her either, Laura and Dylan remained in almost constant contact. In fact, in the days leading up to her disappearance, Laura and Dylan spoke on the phone at least 100 times. I wasn't able to confirm if this communication was via calls or texts, but either way, they were still on speaking terms and they were making the most of it. The two had made plans to meet up on the evening of July 3rd, and later that night, Laura headed toward Kipling subway station in Toronto, where Dylan picked her up, driving her to his home. An hour later, Laura's phone turned off and would never come back on again. Now, fair warning, the case takes a rapid nosedive from here, and the events all take place rather quickly, one right after the other. So buckle down and maybe even take some notes because things are about to get crazy in very rapid succession. After Laura met up with Dylan that evening, Dylan sent out a text message at around 7:30 p.m. to his friend Mark Smitch. The message read, "I'm on a mission, back in 1 hour." No further texts were sent after this. The very next day, Sean Lerner received a notification that the iPad that he'd given Laura had suddenly been renamed Mark's iPad. Safe to assume that Dylan's aforementioned friend, Mark, had come into possession of Laura's iPad. But how? Immediately after this, Dylan took a photo on his cell phone, showing an object wrapped in a blue tarp, located on his farm in Waterloo. And it's been suggested that this photo was shared with Mark. Later that same day, Dylan accepted a same-day delivery for a brand new mattress. I think we can all tell what's probably going on here. Laura spends the night, then all of a sudden Dylan's taking photos of something wrapped in a tarp, then buying a new mattress? Things were getting fishy, to say the least. But if this wasn't clear enough, things are about to get worse. In the days leading up to all this, Dylan had contacted his mechanic friend and asked him to make arrangements to deliver an animal incinerator to his farm. This incinerator arrived on July 5th, 2 days after Laura was last seen. This brings us to July 14th, 2012, the day that Laura's family decided to file a missing person report. See, Laura was known to lose touch with her parents from time to time. After all, they were still caught up in a bit of a disagreement at this point. But it was incredibly unusual for Laura to not make contact with her friends. It's been noted that she spoke to her friends literally every single day up to this point. But when the missing person report was filed, Sean Lerner says that police didn't seem concerned in Laura's case at all, especially after they learned about her mental health issues and her work as an escort. It was almost as if they completely shut down after learning this. 9 days passed by without any leads coming to or from the police who were working the case. But on the evening of July 23rd, Dylan sent a text message to Mark saying, "Barbecue has run its warm-up. It's ready for meat." Immediately after this text was sent, Dylan made a Google search, seeking the correct temperature for cremation. Soon after, Dylan took a photo of Mark standing next to the cooker. The objects that were seen inside the cooker at this point were later described by a forensic expert as resembling human bones. By late July, Laura's final phone bill was delivered to her parents' home. Desperate for answers, her parents opened the bill and looked at her call history. They immediately noticed that the final calls she made were to Dylan, someone she'd supposedly written off and moved on from. This was the biggest red flag her parents could have possibly found, and they immediately called all her other friends, desperate for more information about her secret relationship with Dylan. One of the people her parents reached out to was Sean Lerner. Sean took it upon himself to reach out to Dylan, asking if he had any information about Laura. He sent Dylan a text that read, quote, "I'm not looking to point a finger at anyone, but we're concerned about Laura, and it looks like you were the last person to correspond with her." Dylan initially ignored these texts, but the two later set up a time to meet at a local Starbucks to chat about the situation. When the date finally rolled around, the two spoke briefly before Dylan began making allegations that Laura was nothing but an addict who continued hounding him hoping for a fix. Dylan says he repeatedly denied Laura's requests and had no involvement in her disappearance. But then he made a pretty shocking statement. As the two ended their conversation, Dylan informed Sean that he should have, quote, no reasonable expectation of finding her. This brings us to August of 2012, when the pieces finally began to fit together. Mark had invited a few of his friends over to his mother's home, and they were hanging out in the garage when Mark began rapping. I can't tell if he was rapping as a joke or if he was serious about it, but my gosh, is it awful.
It off on skin and bone, now to lay on some ashes stone. Last time I saw us outside the home, and if you go swimming, you can find a bone. Find a bone? What? Find a bone. If you go swimming, you'll find a bone. Find a bone. Find a bone. You can find a bone. If you go swimming, you'll find a bone. Lay on ashes stone.
In this weird rap, Mark says that she started off as skin and bone, and now she lays on ashy stone. And he ends the segment by claiming, if you go swimming, you can find her phone. I don't know about you, but this sounds like a confession if I've ever heard one. Mark's friends were apparently shocked by this as well, and that's why they eventually agreed to testify against Mark, saying that he would later confess to claiming a girl's life, burning the remains, and then disposing of the evidence in a lake. Mark was very clearly terrible at keeping secrets. This was all investigators needed to pin both Mark and Dylan for the disappearance of Laura Babcock. But this isn't the end of the case by any means. After detectives learned of Mark's ridiculous confession, they obviously pieced together the connection to Laura Babcock's case. But they also started to reinvestigate another crime that involved Dylan's own father, Wayne Millard. Wayne had lost his life a while back, but investigators initially ruled that he'd claimed his own life, resulting in Dylan becoming the heir to his father's multi-million-dollar estate. But now that they learned the extent of Dylan's involvement with Laura, they wanted to re-examine his father's case, planning to pin Dylan for that crime as well. If this weren't bad enough, investigators also learned of a third man who was involved with Dylan. This man had listed a pickup truck for sale on a local shopping app, and Dylan and Mark showed up to test drive it. While out driving the car, they claimed the life of the owner and presumably stole the truck. This victim was also disposed of in the duo's makeshift incinerator. Now, the story of Dylan and Mark goes much deeper than this, and pretty much everyone who knew the two were somehow involved in the case, with a female friend of the two even being accused of helping clean up the scene of the crime and destroying evidence. If you'd like to see a more in-depth look at the crimes of these two, just let me know in the comments and I may revisit this in the future. But for today's video, I want to stay focused on Laura Babcock. For the duo's crimes against Laura, they were each sentenced to 25 years behind bars. Even though Laura's remains have never been found, Dylan has since appealed the charges placed against him regarding the disappearance of Laura, but it seems safe to assume that these appeals will most likely be denied. Thankfully, Laura's family were finally able to get justice for the horror that their daughter was put through. But in the end, this doesn't bring Laura back. It doesn't really solve anything at all. We may never know why Dylan went to such drastic means to get Laura out of his life.
Because he's a fucking douche.
Sense to it.
I'm sorry, because he is a douche.
It's heartwarming to know that this pathetic shell of a man was finally taken off the streets of Toronto. But it doesn't change the fact that the damage is already done.
Done. Yeah. Ali Costiello. After this commercial.
Shalom.
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 Shalom is a very special Hebrew.
Ali Costiel was born in St. Louis, Missouri, but had always dreamed of attending the University of Mississippi. When she was finally given this chance, in her eyes, life couldn't have gotten much better. But then, things changed. Investigators say that there weren't any clues or evidence that could have tipped off Allie's friends before her life was tragically cut short on that July afternoon. Detectives who arrived at the scene of the crime couldn't understand how someone could have done such a thing to a well-behaved and easygoing student. But that's when they honed in on their primary suspect, another student who had a secret agenda that no one could have ever seen coming.
Oh boy, tell us more.
Allie Costill was 21 years old in 2019, attending Mississippi State University in Oxford, Mississippi. Oxford, Mississippi is a relatively small town. There isn't a whole lot going on there. I was there just a couple weeks ago, and best I could tell, it was a town that didn't have much to offer outside of a few restaurants and outdoor stores like Tractor Supply. With a population of about 25,000, it's a quaint little town, very quiet, and certainly a great place for college students to live, as there's only so much trouble you can get into in such a small, lazy town. The University of Mississippi is really the main draw for the town, and I think it's safe to assume that the college is likely where the town gets most of its money as well. The university has an acceptance rate of around 90%, but the reason most people go here is likely because its tuition is relatively low compared to other similar schools. And with the graduation rate of about 65%, it fits right in line with schools that may cost 10 times as much while offering what's essentially the same exact education. This is likely why Allie Costill was so determined to attend the University of Mississippi. A great school, a great price, and usually great people. Allie was attending college with the plans of graduating with a degree in marketing. She was scheduled to graduate in the spring of 2020, much sooner than many of her friends and peers, as she'd been attending summer school on top of her regular college courses. Allie had dreams of getting a job in the fashion industry in some capacity, though she never revealed specifically what type of fashion marketing job that she'd been hoping for, at least not publicly. Allie didn't just attend the University of Mississippi, though. She wasn't just a run-of-the-mill student. She had a fierce passion that few people will ever match. Allie had helped found the Alpha Phi sorority and was even the president of the school's golf club. If this weren't enough, in her free time, she would also help teach fitness classes in the area as well. I don't know how she managed to find time to do all these things, but with summer school stacked on top of all this, it's pretty clear that Allie was a very busy person. But she always made sure to save time for friends and family. Her mother recalled Allie's dreams of attending the university and said that she didn't only have plans of carving out a great career for herself, but she also dreamed of meeting her future husband at the school. Allie felt confident that she'd be able to find a suitable partner and settle down with an honest man by the time she graduated. In the fall of 2016, Allie believed that she had finally met this man when she ran across Brandon Thiesfeld, a student that she fell head over heels for. But unfortunately, these feelings were not mutual. Allie's friends say that they did their best to warn her about Brandon, but she was blinded by his presence. For whatever reason, Allie was drawn to him with a magnetic intensity. She just couldn't keep her mind off of him, but unfortunately these feelings were far from mutual, but Allie couldn't let him go. Over the course of the next few years, Allie would learn a lot about herself, after realizing how low she'd be willing to go to keep Brandon around.
Oh boy.
Oddly enough, Allie didn't actually meet Brandon Thiesfeld while the two were on campus. She actually met him in Fort Worth, Texas back in 2016, but quickly learned that he was a student at the University of Mississippi. For Allie, this likely seemed like the stars were all finally aligning and their relationship was meant to be. But tragically, this simply wasn't true. Now, at the time, Allie certainly didn't know this, but everyone around her knew exactly the type of person that Brandon really was. Brandon was a part of the in crowd. He was popular from the very beginning, at least with other guys his age. As far as women, well, as soon as they actually got to know him, they'd usually go running the other way, but that wasn't true for Allie. She couldn't get enough. According to various friends and acquaintances, Brandon was, well, a terrible person. Now, I don't go around throwing insults like this very often, but I'm serious. Brandon was the very definition of a piece of human garbage. All of Allie's friends recall him as being a total tool. All he ever talked about was his father's money and how he could do whatever he wanted because his dad would always bail him out. It didn't matter if what Brandon was doing was illegal or simply immoral. He'd do whatever he wanted, all the time, always, no matter who he hurt in the process. One of Allie's friends spoke about Brandon, and while this friend wished to remain anonymous, she described him as a pig. She said that he would use his family's money to do whatever he wanted, and that he'd have 6 different girls around him at one time, sitting back and laughing at him. She ended her remarks about Brandon by describing him as, quote, super misogynistic. Other friends recalled Brandon in a similar fashion. They said that he was raised as a, quote, daddy's boy, and that he had no regard for women whatsoever. He viewed them as little more than property to be played with. One friend recalled that he would constantly badger every female that he came into contact with in the dorms.
Yeah, it sounds like
He'd hang out with them,
one.
get what he wanted out of them, and then move on to the next one. Unfortunately, this seems to have been the case with Allie as well. Allie was deeply infatuated with Brandon. In the early stages of their relationship, Allie was under the impression that the two were exclusive, and that they had started dating. But according to Allie's family, she couldn't have been more wrong. Allie's mother recalled Allie coming home from college one day and announcing that she'd met a boy, specifically a boy from Texas. Her mother says that for whatever reason, Allie was always interested in Texas and the people from Texas. So when she met a boy from one of her favorite places, she couldn't have been happy. Allie initially described Brandon as nothing more than a crush, but it soon became clear that they were far more than that. Maddie Norris, one of Allie's closest friends, says that she never even met Brandon. According to Maddie, Brandon always had better things to do than meet Allie's friends and family. Maddie would later describe the relationship between Allie and Brandon as on and off again, but for Allie, Brandon was the only person she cared about. Allie's friends say that she was repeatedly crushed by Brandon. She would constantly make plans with him, then he would never show up. She'd invite friends over to meet him, but he'd disappear just hours before the meetup. She'd scheduled dates or phone calls, but he was never around. This all reached a breaking point in the summer of 2019. By this point, Allie and Brandon had been involved with one another on some level for about 3 years. But then Allie dropped a bombshell on Brandon. She sent him a text message and announced that she might be pregnant. She also sent a photo showing a pregnancy test result that came back as inconclusive. At this point, Allie was a senior in college, planning to graduate in just a few short months in the following spring. She revealed her possible pregnancy to Brandon on the 14th of June at around 10:15 p.m. While Brandon always did his best to dip and run whenever Allie reached out to him, this time was different. He responded almost immediately by saying that she should just take the Plan B pill and move on with her life. He added that he had no plans to keep a child, saying, quote, "I do not want a kid at all." Just minutes later, this was followed by another text that read, "I'm serious, no kid at all. It will ruin my life. I will not help at all." Immediately after these texts, Allie set up a time to meet with Brandon about the supposed pregnancy, but he never showed up, go figure. She scheduled multiple follow-up meetings as well, but he didn't show up to a single one of them. He would always concoct some sort of excuse and claim he was busy or had other plans or simply forgot. It wouldn't be until July of that year that Brandon would finally get around to meeting with Allie. But he didn't plan on simply meeting up with her. He had much bigger plans, and a much darker secret. Allie and Brandon had once again made plans to meet up on the evening of July 19th, 2019. At this point, Allie was expected to have been about 3 months pregnant. But interestingly, police found surveillance footage from that night showing that she'd been at a bar. She got an Uber after leaving the bar and was seen driving home alone, suggesting that she'd likely been drinking. This took place at 11:52 p.m. Just a couple hours later, at 1:28 a.m., believe it or not, Brandon actually showed up for their planned meeting. He picked up Allie and the two drove down to a fishing camp at Sardis Lake. According to photos that were taken at the scene of the crime, the two had been drinking White Claws and eating junk food throughout their drive to the fishing camp. Mind you, this was taking place while the two were operating under the assumption that Allie was pregnant. And for anyone that might not be aware, White Claws are alcoholic, and junk food isn't great for a baby either. The two arrived at the fishing camp at around 2:15 a.m., and according to those who lived nearby, around the same time, a series of shots rang out in the night. A woman who was walking her dog reported hearing the shots between 2:15 and 2:30 a.m., pretty much the exact same time that Brandon and Allie would have arrived. By 10:30 a.m. that same morning, a police officer was passing through the area while conducting his routine patrols of the camp, and that's when he came across a crime scene. Based on the crime scene photos and police officer testimony, when he arrived at the camp, he found Allie lying face down on the ground. Nearby, he found her purse, 2 cans of White Claw, and the aforementioned bag of snacks. There was also a jacket placed on a nearby picnic table. When he approached Allie, it became clear that she had lost her life after being hit by multiple rounds at a somewhat close range. The officer stated that upon closer inspection, Allie had been hit a total of 9 times, though 11 shell casings were found nearby, leaving 2 rounds unaccounted for. The investigator said that in all of his years in the service, he'd never seen someone be hit so many times before. As soon as police confirmed the identity of Allie, they immediately got to work on the case, interviewing her closest friends and family members. In particular, they were interested in the testimony of Allie's friends. After speaking with multiple friends and acquaintances, detectives quickly noticed that there was one name that repeatedly came up in conversation: Brandon Wiesfeld. Brandon was a difficult person to track down, but police were eventually able to get in touch with him, and they asked him to come in for questioning. They didn't reveal that he was a suspect, as far as I can tell. They purely explained that they wanted to hear his testimony from the night of the crime. But Brandon treated the police in the same way that he treated all the women in his life, with blatant disrespect. He told the officers on at least 3 occasions that he would meet them at a specific location at a specific time, but he would never show up. Once he lied on this 3rd occasion, police got much more serious and spoke with a judge and requested to obtain a warrant for his arrest, as well as gain access to his cell phone data. The judge granted this request, and police began to trace Brandon's movements by using his cell phone. They quickly learned that he wasn't even in the state of Mississippi any longer. He had packed his bags and was heading towards Tennessee without ever notifying them. Needless to say, this wasn't going to fly, so police tracked him down after issuing a bolo for his truck, an $80,000 Ford F-150 that he'd purchased, once again, with Daddy's money. About 2 hours after issuing the bolo, Brandon was arrested in Memphis. As soon as police searched Brandon's truck, things got much worse for him. They found a .40 caliber weapon that he had been hiding, a weapon that matched the one used at the scene of the crime. Brandon was immediately extradited back to Mississippi, but believe it or not, things would only get worse from here. When police were doing their best to tie Brandon to the scene of the crime, they requested access to Allie's phone records. While they obviously found the weapon that was used in the crime, they didn't have any sort of motive, and without a motive, it would be a bit more difficult for a jury to find Brandon guilty. Well, it wouldn't take long for them to uncover a mountain of evidence that simply couldn't be ignored. When they began looking through Allie's Apple Watch and iPhone, they were able to use her location data, her fitness data, and her text messages to paint a remarkably clear picture of when the crime took place, how it played out, and what role Brandon had played in things. They were able to confirm via Apple iMessage that Brandon was the last person to have seen Allie on the night that she disappeared. Not only this, but they were able to match their location data to the exact same location at the exact same time. But then came the most damning evidence of all. When looking at the contents of Allie's text messages, they learned that for 3 months, Allie had been leading Brandon to believe that she was pregnant and that the baby was his. Brandon, naturally terrified, refused to do the right thing and just meet up with Allie to talk it over and figure out what role she wanted him to play in all of this. Brandon pretty clearly didn't want a child, but Allie continued to push him to talk about the possibilities. In the end, Brandon made a rash decision that would change the history of his community forever. Police were able to prove that Brandon, terrified of, quote, ruining his life, decided to claim Allie's life and the life of her unborn baby. Or did he? Well, yes, he did claim the life of Allie. But a shocking revelation was announced when an autopsy was conducted on Allie's body. She wasn't pregnant, nor was there any indication that she had been at any point in the recent past. So what was with this strange pregnancy test that she showed to Brandon? Well, who even knows? There are a million reasons why a pregnancy test could come back inconclusive. But it seems that Allie was riding this train for as long as she possibly could, maybe just hoping to get a meeting with Brandon. But here's the thing. We have no way of knowing if Allie knew that she wasn't pregnant. We have no way of knowing if she really was just stringing him along. But what I find really odd is that for the 3 months that she believed she might have been pregnant, she never bothered taking a follow-up pregnancy test to confirm one way or the other. But the most crucial piece of evidence, in my book, that proves that she likely knew that she wasn't pregnant was her attendance at the bar that night and the white claws that were found at the scene of the crime. Allie was a smart girl. She almost certainly knew that if she was pregnant, then she shouldn't be drinking. To me, this seems to allude to the idea that Allie may have been so deeply in love with Brandon that she was willing to do almost anything just to get a few moments alone with him and try to hash things out. But Brandon was just too much of a coward to face the possible consequences of his actions and just sit down and have a talk with her. And the thing that bothers me most is that if Brandon had half a brain, he could have pieced all this together as well. But instead, he decided to put an end not only to their relationship, but to an entire life. Allie had been working so hard to get her degree so that she could begin her dream career. She tried so hard to love someone and begin a life with someone, but unfortunately, it was someone who just couldn't love her back. Allie had everything going for her, but this moronic monster stole all of that and more. After Brandon's arrest, police came across a handwritten note in which Brandon accepted responsibility for his actions. The note was addressed to his parents, and he explained that he was sorry for what he had done, and sorry for the pain that he had caused them. He explained that he'd been having dark thoughts for quite some time, years leading up to the crime. He said that he couldn't explain where these thoughts came from, but that he'd finally acted on them and deeply regretted his actions. At the end of it all, Brandon was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole once he turns 65. It would seem that, at long last, Brandon had finally committed a crime that his dad couldn't bail him out of.
Got your happy price line. Everyone knows Halloween is all about black, and Michaels has all the decor we need. But don't forget about black.
It was August of 2011 when Caitlin Markham was last seen. She'd been working on her laptop on the evening of August 13th, with a friend noting that she wasn't her usual happy-go-lucky self. She was very reserved and may have even seemed as though something was bothering her, but we don't know for sure. Caitlin was last seen alongside her fiancé just before 11 p.m. that evening, but by the following morning, she was gone. Her fiancé reported her as a missing person, but her case went cold almost as quickly as it had begun. Her remains would be found 2 years later, and the state of her body was, well, confusing. The crime scene just didn't make sense. And worse yet, police were at a loss for who could have been responsible, until they uncovered a shocking clue in the investigation. Before we dive into today's story, I want to let you know about today's sponsor, AG1. AG80, working out or clips in the 5 week. Our loved ones lit up the room. Maybe even a bit weird, but not in the bad way. Oftentimes when cases like this pop up, families tend to tell the exact same story, saying that their loved ones lit up the room, loved everyone, and so on and so forth, but in Caitlin's case, that really does appear to have been true. She was a very quirky young woman who wasn't afraid to be herself. Caitlin lived alongside her family and fiancé in Fairfield, Ohio. Fairfield is a rather popular city just 25 miles away from Cincinnati. With a population of around 42,000 people, it's certainly not a small town, but it's not a very big town either. It's largely made up of suburbs and young families, and it seems to be a great place to be. I've seen mixed reports when it comes to how safe Fairfield may be. Some sources claim that it's incredibly dangerous and that crime rates are remarkably high, though other reports say that crime isn't really any higher here than anywhere else in the country. I'm not sure what to make of this, but if you want my personal opinion, it seems like a great place to be. There's a heck of a lot to do in Fairfield. There are heaps of attractions for young families to visit, more parks than I could count, and tons of great restaurants to see. The only real trouble with Fairfield is that it's a fairly lengthy drive to get anywhere, with the average work commute being up to 88% higher than in other parts of the state. Caitlin had been attending college as an art student, and this seems to have been the perfect career path for her. We don't know for sure just how long she'd been dating her fiance, John Carter, but the two appeared to have been together for quite a while. I can't tell if they met at college or if they may have been together much longer than that, but whatever the case may be, the two were inseparable, and it was clear that they were deeply in love with one another. Caitlin had been living in a small condo in Fairfield, and her fiance would often stay over with her. She didn't plan to live here very long, though, as Caitlin and John had plans to move to Colorado in the fall of 2011. But unfortunately, these plans would never be carried out. That's not because the two suddenly decided not to leave Fairfield. Rather, it's because Caitlin would become caught up in a haunting crime that she wouldn't survive. It was August 13th, 2011. It was a day like any other for Caitlin and John. The two had been spending most of the evening at Caitlin's condo in Fairfield. Caitlin had been busy with schoolwork, trying to get everything filed away before she missed her deadlines. On this particular evening, a friend of the couple had been hanging out at the apartment with them. Later on into the night, the friend decided to leave and head to a nearby party that was just a few miles away. Both Caitlin and John decided to stay home, and the friend left sometime around 10:45 that night, saying goodbye to the two for what would unknowingly be the last time. As the friend left the home, he noticed that Caitlin wasn't acting like her usual self. While she was normally smiling from ear to ear and making jokes and generally being a pleasant person to be around, this evening was much different. The friend mentioned that Caitlin seemed reserved, distant even. He said that she stayed on the couch the entire time he had been there, and this appears to have been for several hours. The entire time she never really moved or got up at all, she just sat there working on her laptop. When the friend left that evening, he recalled that Caitlin and John were the only two people left in the condo. John decided to leave the condo soon after, heading out around 11 p.m. He headed off to a party in Hamilton, then went home sometime around 2 a.m. and remained there for the rest of the night. He woke up around 2:30 p.m. the following day, then made it to work at Papa John's around 5 p.m., leaving just 2 hours later around 7. While this was a fairly normal schedule for John, there was one big problem. His soon-to-be wife was nowhere to be found, and he couldn't get in touch with her. John claims that he hadn't been able to get in touch with Caitlin since he left her condo the evening before. He called 911 shortly after arriving for his shift at Papa John's, telling the dispatcher everything that he knew. He explained that he didn't want to report her missing so soon, but he was getting worried after he hadn't been able to find her. Just hours later, Caitlin had failed to show up for her job at David's Bridal, and this is when investigators knew something was very wrong. They collected all the information that they could from John, but considering he'd been asleep for most of the day, he really wasn't much help. Several friends and family members were also interviewed, but no one had any idea where Caitlin could have gone. But one thing was for sure. Wherever she had gone, she hadn't gone willingly, because she left behind her purse, keys, and her dog. Mysteriously, her cell phone was missing, but it appears to have been turned off. Police say that volunteers began searching for Caitlin almost immediately. Her family printed out missing person flyers in record time and began handing them out all throughout the Fairfield area and other nearby towns. As far as police could tell, no one had seen Caitlin since the evening of August 13th, meaning John, her fiance, was the last person to see her alive. After coming to this conclusion, John was called in for a polygraph test, and the results were interesting.
Oh boy.
Police got to work right away, trying to track down Caitlin, and one of the first people they brought in for questioning was John Carter, Caitlin's fiance. After determining that John was the last person to see Caitlin alive, they certainly had a few questions to ask him. Unfortunately, John didn't have many answers. They asked John all the obvious questions. Where did you last see her? What was she wearing? Did anything seem wrong? John was seemingly answering everything honestly, but then the questions got a bit more specific. Detectives asked John if he knew anything about Caitlin's disappearance. John claimed he didn't, but the polygraph operator claimed that was a lie. When they asked if he was involved in her disappearance, he said he wasn't. That was also a lie. Police soon noticed that John also had several scratch marks on the side of his neck. When he was questioned about where these had come from, He claimed they were from a razor, but investigators didn't believe scratches like this would come from any razor. When police spoke with a friend of John's, the friend said that he didn't notice the scratches until the day after Caitlin had vanished. Over the coming weeks and months, John was asked to speak with police on at least 3 occasions, with them using a polygraph during each of these sessions. Now, while these machines aren't exactly reliable, they can certainly provide investigators with some good information. And that's definitely what they did in this case. Police say that in all 3 sessions, John was caught telling lies about where he was the night that Caitlin disappeared. While they couldn't prove it just yet, investigators knew something was up, and they were determined to prove it. But that was a lot easier said than done. That's when investigators uncovered 2 key witnesses that would help blow the case wide open. As it would turn out, 2 teenagers, who were just 15 years old at the time of the crime, had been walking by John's home on the evening of Caitlin's disappearance. The 2 teens had snuck out of their homes that night, planning to attend a party that was taking place a few miles away. As they waited outside for another friend to pick them up, they noticed 2 cars drive up to John's mother's house. One of the cars was a red Ford Focus, and the other was a dark-colored sedan with a male driver. The man in the Ford Focus pulled into the driveway, then opened the home's garage. He rummaged around inside for a few minutes before getting back into his car. It's unclear if he removed anything from the garage or if he just looked around and left. Police were later able to confirm that John had a red Ford Focus registered in his name, and they presumed he had been the driver that evening. The man in the other vehicle wasn't immediately identified. The teens say that when the men arrived, they were coming from the direction of Caitlin's house. When they left, they headed back in that same direction. Mind you, all of this took place just after 2 a.m. But according to John's statements with police, he had been in bed by this point after having been at a party. Things only got worse for John from here. When police spoke with one of Caitlin's friends in the days after her disappearance, the friend had a pretty interesting encounter with John that she was itching to share with detectives. At this point, Caitlin had been missing for just over 48 hours as far as I can tell. But the friend explained that when she spoke with John about Caitlin's disappearance, she noticed he kept speaking about her in the past tense. Now, for any investigator, this is always a massive red flag. If this isn't an obvious sign of guilt or some sort of concealed knowledge of a crime, then nothing is. To top this off, when police asked for more details about John and his relationship with Caitlin, the friend explained that John had always seemed incredibly possessive of Caitlin. Well, it's only natural for someone to have a healthy amount of jealousy when it comes to their partner or spouse. The friend says that John's jealousy was to the point of being aggressive. She says that Caitlin would often complain about how insecure John was, and that he would get very upset if she even talked to someone of the opposite gender. This all grew very concerning for detectives when the friend finally revealed that Caitlin had been considering breaking off their engagement. Caitlin had confided in her friend that she was incredibly unhappy with John's lifestyle, and she couldn't support his decisions anymore. He supposedly had an addiction problem and would also look at adult content online, something that Caitlin wasn't comfortable with. Worse yet, John would repeatedly pressure her into doing things in the bedroom that she just wasn't interested in, and she was tired of satisfying his strange fantasies. Now, if you recall, I mentioned that the couple had plans to move to Colorado in a few months. Well, it seems that John was the main one who was wanting to move to Colorado, and Caitlin doesn't appear to have been completely on board with this plan. John mentioned in an interview that he never wanted Caitlin to feel forced to move, which is a pretty strange choice of words if you ask me. In my own opinion, this proves that John probably knew he was being a bit pushy about things, but others may disagree. Having been an inconsiderate jerk in the past, I've gotten pretty good at spotting people like this, and John ticks all the boxes in my book. In the end, the two repeatedly delayed their plans to move, and this seems to further the idea that Caitlin simply didn't want to go. But I haven't been able to confirm whether or not this is entirely true. It's just what the evidence and witness statements seem to allude to. After several more months had passed, police had still found no leads in the search for Caitlin. They reached one dead end after another. While they certainly had enough evidence to suggest that John was involved, they didn't have enough info to prove it or even charge him with anything. But that's when things took a dramatic turn. One that no one hoped for, and certainly not one that anyone expected. It was the spring of 2013. The flowers were in full bloom, and the weather couldn't have been more perfect. But for the Markham family, perfect was far from what they had been feeling. It had been nearly 2 years since their daughter had gone missing, and they'd spent every moment they had searching for her, desperate for answers. A couple had been visiting Cedar Grove, Indiana, wandering through the woods in search of scrap metal or other valuables that may have been dropped or left behind. Little did they know that their hobby would soon lead to a massive breakthrough in the investigation for Caitlin's whereabouts. As they were scavenging through the area with their metal detectors, they came across a strange-looking rock, unlike anything they had seen before. But they soon realized this was no rock. This was a human jawbone. Police were called to the scene of the crime immediately. A team of researchers cordoned off the area and began an investigation into the remains. Before long, the discovery was tied to the disappearance of Caitlin, and investigators were forced to make the call to Caitlin's parents that every parent and family member dreads in a situation like this. In this particular case, all this did was reopen the family's wounds, as officers didn't really have any good information to share with the family. There was no silver lining because they had no leads, no proof, and virtually no evidence. When the coroner examined the bones, things only got worse. The bones had been left in the weather for so long, there was no way to tell what had happened to the victim or who had put them there. There wasn't any way to tell how Caitlin had lost her life, but there was one particular detail that was fairly strange. Now, I don't know the specifics of how the coroner determined this, but the investigator had reason to believe that Caitlin hadn't been buried in these woods for all this time. According to a more thorough examination, Caitlin had been buried for a while, then dug up, and then moved to a new location. Where this original location may have been, no one knows for sure. However, some speculate that it may have simply been an alternate location within the same patch of woods, but that's just a guess. The only thing to mention about the state of the remains is that there was evidence to suggest that Caitlin had been wounded on her wrist around the time that she lost her life. But the coroner couldn't be certain about this either. The coroner noted 3 to 4 wounds on her wrist, but it was never determined what may have caused these wounds. Though the reports that I found online suggest that they may have been caused by some sort of blade, but even that isn't known for certain. But here's the real kicker. No sooner than these remains were uncovered, the case went cold yet again. By 2015, Caitlin's father had urged the police to continue with the investigation, and the local police, after much pushback, finally agreed. They brought in new investigators to take a fresh look at the case. While they admit that they did have a suspect, they still didn't have enough evidence to pursue anyone legally. A few suspects were questioned, but everyone was set free without charges. It would be another 8 years until police would make any more progress in the case, but finally, in March of 2023, an arrest was made. By March of 2023, police announced that they had detained yet another suspect in Caitlin's disappearance. By this time, they felt confident that they could secure a conviction. I'm sure most of you expected this outcome by now, but their newfound suspect was none other than John Carter, Caitlin's fiancé. See, when the coroner was examining Caitlin's remains, investigators uncovered that Caitlin had been wrapped in a sheet of plastic, as well as a garden weed barrier. You know, the black fabric that you put down when setting up a flower bed to avoid weeds popping up everywhere? Well, as luck would have it, police were able to secure a search warrant for John's mother's shed. Inside the shed, they found gardening fabric that was an exact match to the fabric that had been found around Caitlin's remains. Police also found a list of other items that they believe were connected to the crime, but this list has never been made public in the hope of protecting the integrity of the investigation. During their search, police also uncovered several other key pieces of evidence and inconsistencies in John's alibi, as well as discrepancies in the stories that he told officers about the night that Caitlin had vanished. Cell phone records from both John and Caitlin show that both of their cell phones were turned off around midnight on August 13th. The evening that Caitlin vanished. John claimed he had been at a party at this time, but police felt it was a bit suspicious that both of their phones had been shut off at the exact same moment that evening. If this weren't strange enough, John claimed that he hadn't texted Caitlin at all the evening that she disappeared. However, phone records prove that this was a lie. He sent dozens of messages to her leading up to around 11:36 p.m. when the messages abruptly stopped and their phones were shut off just minutes later. When police requested to look at John's phone, the texts between himself and Caitlin from that specific evening were mysteriously missing. Every other text they had shared was still there, but this specific block of text messages from that night had vanished. Police wanted to check Caitlin's phone as well, but it was never located. It was believed to have been left inside of her car on the night of her disappearance, but this was never confirmed, and all these years later, her phone has still never been found. When asked about these text messages, John initially claimed he didn't text Caitlin that evening at all. But when investigators revealed that they had phone records that proved otherwise, he said he deleted the messages by accident. Then he claimed he deleted them to make room for new texts, as he was getting flooded with texts from friends on the day that Caitlin was reported missing. This man just couldn't keep his story straight. But all of this leads up to one final revelation that took place after the search warrant was issued for John's mother's home. Inside, they found a notebook, a diary of sorts, I guess you could say, that included a few notes from John. The notebook was filled with various ramblings and unimportant writings, but one page in particular caught the attention of investigators. Researchers say that the entry appears to have been a conversation between John and what they call a demon of sorts. The note reads as follows. Deep down, I love her.
You ought to kill her.
But I love her.
She must die.
I can't kill her.
Yes, you can.
No.
Yes.
How do you talk me into all these things?
I'm just that good.
But you're bad.
I know.
How do I kill you?
You can't.
You're right.
About what?
Nothing. This was followed by a single sentence that read, I slit your wrists with the key to your heart. I don't know about you, but that final sentence sounds like a confession if I've ever heard one, especially considering the wounds that were found on Caitlin's wrists. Needless to say, the future is not looking great for John Carter. John was arrested and held on $1 million bail. Somehow, he was able to make this payment, and he's currently a free man. His trial is set to take place next year in 2024, and investigators have every reason to believe he will be found guilty. John has never made any comments about what this note could mean. So, is he mentally ill? Does he really believe he was speaking with a demon? We just don't know at the moment. However, all of this will be answered at trial, but as it stands, the case is still technically unsolved, but don't imagine it will stay that way for long.
Thanks to this waterfront hotel on Booking.com, even Yankees fans are loving Boston.
Oh, no, we're keeping tabs on our rivals.
We love Boston.
Hun,
With so many choices, you can be a fan of any U.S. city. Booking.com, Booking.yeah.
the year is 1975. For the Foreman family, life was moving along perfectly. They had two wonderful kids. They were young and deeply in love, and everything was looking up. But on Mrs. Foreman's 25th birthday, tragedy would strike. As her 5-year-old son Jason was playing outside in the woods near their home, he disappeared. The family and nearby neighbors searched for the boy for hours, days, weeks, and eventually years. They found no clues or evidence that would explain his sudden disappearance. The missing boy wouldn't be found until 7 years later, when investigators met with a neighbor who made a truly disgusting confession to a crime of devastating proportions. The Foreman family had been living in South Kingstown, Rhode Island for a number of years. One of the great things about South Kingstown, and one of the things that keeps people coming back, is the beautiful beaches. The town is home to more than 10 miles of undisturbed beaches, as well as several large parks and recreation areas for small families like the Foremans. If this weren't enough, crime also isn't a particularly big deal in South Kingstown, and it never really has been. Sure, there are a few areas where things can get a bit shady, but that's true for just about every city in America. Overall, South Kingstown is just a wonderful place to be, a city rich in history and filled with things to keep young minds occupied while parents go on about their daily lives. For the Foreman family, it doesn't appear like they could have been any happier in their own little slice of heaven. The family lived in the Peacedale area on High Street. A quick look on Google Maps Street View shows that this street is still to this day just stunning. The Foremans lived on top of a hill right next to the local fire station. And from what I can tell, their home used to back up to a patch of dense woods, but it appears as though most of these wooded areas have since been cut down to make way for new housing, but I can't tell that for certain as we don't know what their specific address was. The family consisted of Joyce Foreman, John Foreman, and their 3 kids, Raven, Jason, and Jason's older brother, whose name I wasn't able to determine. The family members all got along well with one another, and there were several other kids who lived in the nearby local area, making it the perfect place to raise a growing family. Jason and his older brother would often hang out with some of these other kids, and this was the case on May 18th of 1975. May 18th was Joyce's 25th birthday. She'd been hanging out at home that day, with Jason and his brother heading out to play for the afternoon. Joyce says that she could hear the kids playing behind the home in the woods all throughout the afternoon, and she last remembers hearing the boys laughing and playing sometime around 3:30 p.m. But soon after that, things got quiet. Joyce didn't think anything of this at the time, but when Jason's brother returned home later that afternoon, Jason was nowhere to be found. His mother went out back to try to round him up, but he was gone. The family all worked together to try to find Jason and bring him home, but it was as though he vanished into thin air. His mother knew he couldn't have gotten very far, and all of the neighbors in the area soon joined in to help search for him, but still, there was no sign of him. We don't know where Jason's older brother may have been during the time that Jason disappeared, but it seems safe to assume that he likely just wandered off with the other children to play elsewhere. Jason's brother hadn't seen him since earlier that afternoon, and with no signs of him by nightfall, the family decided it was time to call in the help of the police. We don't know too much about the search efforts that were conducted for Jason officially. At least not the ones that involve the police. We know that officers took witness statements and searched for Jason far and wide, but most of the specifics of this search have been lost to time, or they were never publicly mentioned in the first place. When searching newspapers from that time period, I wasn't able to find a single mention of Jason until 1982. And that's when things began to take a pretty disturbing turn. By this point, the Foremans had been tirelessly searching for their missing son for more than 7 years. But in all this time, not a single shred of evidence was ever found by investigators. But all of that changed on April 15th. The Foremans had several neighbors who lived in close proximity to them. Their houses were all very close to one another, as is the case in many suburban neighborhoods. This meant that whatever happened at your neighbor's house, you probably knew about it. This was true when news began to spread about a disturbance involving a 14-year-old paperboy named Dale Sherman. Dale had been delivering papers one day when Michael Woodmensey noticed the boy and asked him to come inside for a bit. Michael lived directly across the street from the Foremans, but at the time it doesn't appear as though anyone witnessed Michael talking with the teen. Before their conversation was over, Michael had lured the boy into his home with the promise of giving him alcohol. Dale spoke with the New York Times in March of 2011 and recalled the day that he'd been at Michael's home, saying that Michael made good on his promise to give him alcohol, but that wasn't all he gave him. Dale recalls that soon after drinking the alcohol, he began to get incredibly tired, so much so that he could barely keep his eyes open. While all of this was going on, Michael suddenly stood up and grabbed a nearby bandana, wrapping it around Dale's neck and attempting to take his life. Somehow, in the chaos of all this, Dale managed to fight Michael off and escape his grasp. Dale hightailed it out of there and immediately ran home to tell his father. His father didn't take this report lightly, and rather than call the police, he approached Michael one-on-one. Dale's father walked over to Michael's home, knocked on the door, then promptly punched him in the face. As Dale's father was heading back home, he saw the police at a nearby residence, and he flagged them down and reported what had happened to his son. Police spoke with the two briefly, then asked that everyone come down to the police station so that they could take an official statement and try to get to the bottom of things. And this is where the case took another, much darker turn. When police were speaking with Michael, they began to suspect that he may have had a few more secrets than he was leading them to believe. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly what happened when they questioned him about his assault against Dale. But that's because they began to suspect that Michael may have been holding on to a secret much more disturbing than the one they'd actually been interrogating him about. During their conversations with Michael, at least one of the officers began to wonder if Michael may have had some information about Jason Foreman, the boy who at this point had vanished more than 7 years ago. They didn't want to ask Michael outright for fear that he might clam up and conceal the truth. So gradually, they began to steer the interrogation in a different direction, tossing in questions about Jason Foreman just here and there. But in a shocking twist, Michael actually opened up about what he knew regarding Jason Foreman's disappearance. Before long, he spilled everything he had known about the boy, and even told officers that he knew exactly what happened to Jason and where he was today. We don't know what specifically led to Michael's confession, but while being interrogated about his involvement in the crimes against Dale, Michael came clean and admitted that he had seen Jason on the day that he vanished back in May of 1975. Not only this, but he'd been in direct contact with the boy just minutes before he disappeared. The details of how all of this played out have never been revealed publicly. Even all these years later, police have kept certain aspects of the crime private in order to save the family from any more heartache. All we know for sure is that, much like in the case of Dale, Michael had spoken with Jason and managed to lure him into his house. We don't know how Michael convinced Jason to follow him home, but whatever lies he made up, the boy believed them. This is probably a good time to explain that Michael Woodmansey was just 16 years old at the time that all of this unfolded. He was still a kid himself. But Michael wasn't your typical teen by any means. Michael had seemingly been battling dark fantasies for a long time. But on May 18th of 1975, these fantasies would finally be unleashed. Once Michael had taken Jason to his home, he attacked the young boy. The only aspect of the crime that we know for certain is that at some point in the afternoon, Michael grabbed a knife from his kitchen and ambushed young Jason. Why he did this remains a mystery. But in the end, Jason lost his life. We don't know what he may have done or said to Jason before this crime took place, but we have a pretty hefty suspicion about what took place afterward. See, there's a reason why police never located the remains of Jason. Usually when a person goes missing, if they're not found alive, their remains are found a while later. But that wasn't true in Jason's case. He had simply vanished entirely, never to be seen again. But as police were speaking with Michael about the crime during his interrogation, he made a pretty bizarre statement. After confessing to the crime, he immediately got nervous and mentioned a journal or a diary or some sort of notebook that he kept in his room. Explained to officers that if they searched his home, they would find the book. But he wanted to assure them that whatever was inside this journal was purely fiction. But as far as we can tell, it wasn't. When officers found the book, their jaws hit the floor. This journal didn't just include the ramblings of a teen or a young adult. It included detailed accounts of what had happened to Jason all those years ago. Now, naturally, the exact contents of this book have never been made public. In fact, police haven't released a single word from this journal after all this time. The only reason we know what was inside is because Jason's sister spoke with officers about the journal. And they shared many of the contents with her, and she openly revealed what Michael had done to her brother all those years ago. And I promise, it's nothing you would have ever expected. Jason's sister, Raven, is now obviously an adult, and she's spoken with various news outlets in recent years about the contents of Michael's home and what investigators found during their interrogation. Raven says that while police didn't reveal anything about this journal publicly, they did share several key details with her and explain the contents of the journal, though they seem to have refused to show it to her directly. Raven spoke about the contents of the journal and explained that the journal didn't just contain a detailed account of what happened to her brother, but it had become, well, a recipe book of sorts. She says that the journal described in detail what Michael had done to Jason after claiming his life. And to keep it simple and very clear, Michael ate Jason.
No way.
His motive for doing this has never been clear, but after Jason had been dealt with accordingly, Michael couldn't just ditch Jason's bones in a landfill or toss them in a creek somewhere. No, that would be too weird and twisted. So what better way to hide a body from the police than to clean each of the bones and then encase them in shellac and display them on your dresser? Now, you've probably heard the phrase, "the truth is stranger than fiction." Well, that's certainly true here. While Michael insisted that the contents of this journal were fiction, Raven says that the police have an overwhelming amount of evidence that proves that the accounts written inside this journal were entirely real. Now, some reports claim that Jason's bones were displayed on Michael's dresser as if they were trophies, though other reports claim that the bones had been shellacked and kept inside of a box. I don't know which of these reports is more accurate, but needless to say, investigators had all the evidence they needed to secure a conviction. But this is where the case takes yet another turn, and again, it's not a good one. See, when investigators were pursuing the case, they were running all of the details by the Foreman family. While officers wanted to secure a conviction of first-degree murder, they were concerned about the impact that the trial would have on the Foreman family. Needless to say, the Foreman family had already been to hell and back, and to make them sit through a trial and hear each of the gruesome details of their son's final moments may have just pushed them over the edge. To get past this, police offered Jason's father a way to sidestep this process. Rather than pursue a conviction of first-degree murder, they would pursue second-degree murder. This would still secure Michael Woodmansey a 40-year conviction, but it would keep the family from having to hear all of the details inside the journal, and also keep them from having to see their son's remains on display when they were used as evidence in the trial. Jason's father agreed to this plea deal, and Michael was sent to prison for 40 years instead of getting a life sentence. But once again, the case takes yet another turn, and this may be the darkest twist yet. The backlash from this case was serious. The entire community of South Kingstown was enraged by what Michael had done, and to say that he had a target on his back would be an understatement. When Michael was sent to prison, he had to be sent to an out-of-state facility in Massachusetts for his own protection. But considering he was prosecuted under Rhode Island law, that meant that all of Rhode Island's rules and regulations regarding prisoners were still applicable in Michael's case. One of these being the so-called good time law. This law allows prisoners of various convictions to receive lighter sentences for good behavior. In general, the law will allow a prisoner to have 10 days removed from his sentence for every 30 days of good behavior, essentially lessening some sentences by up to 33%. Now, there's definitely some ifs, ands, and buts regarding this law, but this is, very generally speaking, what the law provides for these prisoners. As you might expect, Michael exploited this law to the best of his ability, and was only required to serve 28 years of a 40-year sentence. When news of this came out publicly and locals found out that Michael would be heading back to Rhode Island in 2011, they were furious. So much so that several locals admitted to purchasing weapons in anticipation of Michael's return. But these weapons weren't to be used for protection. Many locals spoke out against Michael and directly confessed that if he ever stepped foot back in their community, they'd kill him. And they meant it. One of these people was Jason's own father, who has sworn on multiple occasions that he has every intention of killing Michael Woodmansey if he's ever able to find him. Jason's father feels a certain amount of guilt for accepting the plea bargain that was offered by investigators all those years ago. He says that had he known about the good time law, he would have never agreed to that deal. Now, he fears that if Michael is released into society again, he may claim the life of someone else's child, and Jason's father says he feels solely responsible for that possibility. Thankfully, Michael wasn't released, at least not fully. While Michael was released from prison, he agreed to be sent to a mental health facility for the remainder of his life. Michael is in his 60s now, as far as I can tell, and he knew how dangerous it would be if he went back to the Rhode Island community. There were riots and protests all throughout the state, filled with people who wanted to see Michael 6 feet under. When he learned of this news, he knew he didn't stand a chance at having a proper life ever again, and he's now residing at the Eleanor Slater Hospital in Cranston, Rhode Island, where he'll likely remain for the rest of his days. Jason's father, John, says that he'll search high and low to find Michael and ensure that he doesn't hurt anyone ever again. And John's family say that they have